This is Rob Fuentes. I'm the President and CEO of the ENO Center for Transportation. I want to welcome you to this webinar, New Approaches to Support the Next Generation of Scenario Planning in Transportation. I'm joined here today at ENO with our partners on this project, the Federal Highway Administration, Renaissance Planning Group, and the National Association of Regional Councils. The plan for this webinar is to highlight key pieces of new Federal Highway Guidebook on scenario, as well as a synthesis of a report from NARC that surveyed 24 regional entities on how they're actually using scenario planning on the ground today. We're then going to have a plenary discussion among the panelists, and we'll take your questions and your comments through the question function on the webinar webpage. And frankly, we think this probably couldn't come at a better time. As everyone on the phone knows, we're right now going through a period of dramatic change that's having transformative effects on our nation's transportation system in cities, states, and communities across the country. From remarkable demographic and cultural changes to the enormous complexities that come with rapid globalization, to our changing natural environment and sources and uses of energy, a veritable revolution in technology, and the political and financial challenges that are dominating the discussion, not just here in Washington, but it's in cities and states and state capitals all across the country. Each of these trends brings uncertainty in its own right, and importantly for this discussion, each has big impacts on our nation's transportation system. But in order for us to accommodate our nation's projected growth, we need strategies and techniques, new strategies and techniques. In short, yesterday's solutions cannot address tomorrow's challenges. Now, this is not necessarily a new concept, as those of us who've been around for a while may recall a lot of work pioneered in places like Sacramento and Salt Lake City and Minneapolis around blueprint planning a few years ago. The idea was to specifically connect metropolitan growth with transportation investments by examining land use patterns, density, and urban form to find innovative solutions to challenges like housing, like carbon emissions, agricultural preservation, and economic development. And so as you're going to hear from our presenters, scenario planning tools enable practitioners to effectively plan for these changes and uncertainties through decision-making processes that not only consider what is likely to happen, but what could happen, and also what communities want to happen in the future. New attention to these sophisticated tools is partly due to new provisions that are contained in the MAP 21 legislation and the move towards a more performance-based planning. So here on the call with me today, we're first going to hear from Ken Petty at the Federal Highway Administration, Michael Berry, also from Federal Highway, and then Kate from Renaissance Planning Group, who will present the key elements from the new guidebook, and Eric Zimmerman from NARC will summarize the findings of their new report. We're then going to take your questions through the question function on the webinar website. You can go ahead and submit those questions and comments anytime during the presentations. If you've registered for this webinar, you'll receive an email when the guidebook and the NARC report is ready for release. So I think you're going to find this report and discussion today very interesting and timely. I want to thank you all again for taking the time to join us today. And with that, I want to turn it over to Ken Petty at the Federal Highway Administration.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Ken Petty. I'm the Director for the FHWA Office of Planning, and it's certainly my pleasure to speak briefly with you on what's happening in the world of scenario planning within FHWA. The USDOT and FHWA are actively encouraging the use of and support of scenario planning, and we believe the use of scenario planning can help states, MPOs, and local governments address potential impacts of transportation projects and help them respond to stakeholder and public feedback obtained throughout the transportation planning process. Scenario planning traditionally combines three main elements: consistency, depicting an array of conditions that could logically coexist; depicting a future that could evolve from current conditions, even if it's very different from the present, and focus on broad implications as opposed to detailed predictions. This includes assessing the relationship between transportation and the social, environmental, and economic development of the region, in which FHWA sees scenario planning as an enhancement of and not a replacement for the traditional transportation planning process. It enables communities and transportation agencies to better prepare for the future. It also highlights the major forces that may shape the future and identifies how the various forces may interact, rather than attempt to predict one specific outlook. As a result, decision makers are prepared to recognize various forces to make more informed decisions in the present and be able to adjust and strategize to meet tomorrow's needs. Now, let me give you an inside track. In the coming weeks, FHWA will be sharing the results of a study we conducted to evaluate the costs and benefits associated with developing multiple scenarios for consideration as part of the development of a long-range plan. Now, this report or this study is specific to MPOs. However, the study looks at and challenges the use of scenario planning in the transportation planning process and consists of various results from the Center for Urban Transportation Research survey, including 9 notable practices or case studies. Within the report, you'll see some key findings that highlight scenario planning as it adds benefits by providing additional data analysis and public input that can guide and informs the transportation planning and decision-making process. It shows that scenario planning is most beneficial when entities have the flexibility to use the approach that suit their needs. And it also shows that scenario planning can create additional costs to be incurred, and certain approaches can be more time and resource intensive to others. So certainly stay tuned for more information from us, FHWA. With that, I'll turn it over to Mike Berry. Mike?
Thanks, Ken. Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Berry. I am a GIS specialist and a planner in the Office of Planning here with Federal Highways in D.C. I just want to briefly go over and reiterate a few of the points that Ken presented to you about scenario planning as far as what the benefits are, and then also what we do here, our role in reaching out to help the MPOs carry out workshops across the country. The benefits of scenario planning: 1, they facilitate public participation, consensus building, and partnership. Secondly, they provide technical assistance to planning agency staff. 3, they foster sustainable, livable communities. And 4, they highlight the opportunities to promote economic development and a good quality of life. And finally, integrate land use and transportation planning by creating transportation scenarios that include an array of land uses and generating discussions about alternative land use and transportation futures. As far as outreach goes, the main way we do that is through some peer exchanges and workshops. Federal Highways sponsors these workshops nationwide to share information on effective applications of scenario planning at the state, regional, and local levels. These workshops bring together interested states, regional, and local agencies. Federal Highway and community members, among others, participate. Speakers from peer agencies also participate, sharing what they've learned, success factors, and notable practices. Any agency can request a customized workshop by using the application available on our scenario planning website, which I'll give to you in just a moment. But as far as what has happened recently with the workshops, we've had 2 that were the most recent that I'll just briefly update you on to give you an idea how they play out and where they played out. In January of 2017, we worked on the Mid-America Regional Council in Kansas City, Missouri, and this workshop was a 1.5-day scenario planning workshop that was held in January 31st through February 1st in Kansas City, and the MPO that hosted it was the Mid-America Regional Council, or MARC for short. The workshop presented an opportunity for MARC to share information about its scenario planning activities, as well as learn from 3 peer agencies about their scenario planning experiences and perspectives. Peers who were invited to participate in the workshop and actually gave presentations and spoke were the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, Maricopa Association of Governments, and the Wasatch Front Regional Council. Another recent peer exchange workshop that we had for scenario planning was the Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization in Chesapeake, Virginia, and this one took place in November of 2016. Again, this was a 1.5-day scenario planning workshop in Chesapeake, Virginia, and it was hosted by the Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization. And our agency, the Federal Highway Administration, sponsored this workshop under its scenario planning program. And if you are interested in more information on the workshops and how we put these together and what role you would take in putting one of these on, if there are MPOs listening, you can go to the following website, www.fhwa for Federal Highways, .dot.gov/planning. That's www.fhwa.dot.gov/planning. And also on that website, once you get there, you can see a list of past workshops that we've been involved in. Click on any one of those workshops, and there's a really extensive wonderful breakdown and summary of everything that took place during these workshops over the past couple of years.
We should also highlight, Mike, that FHWA costs or pays for the costs associated with peer exchanges.
Yes, it is.
So with that nomination or the submission, if approved, we'll cover the cost to bring peers together to talk about your scenario planning circumstance. Anything else, Mike?
That's it.
All right. Back over to you.
Okay, now we're going to turn it over to Kate Ange from the Renaissance Planning Group.
Thanks, everyone, and good afternoon. We are happy to be here. Let me make sure our slides are to basically present some of the key concepts and findings from an upcoming document entitled Next Generation Scenario Planning, a Transportation Practitioner's Guide. This work was funded by FHWA, and we are just wrapping up that final publication. It's our hope that this guide provides kind of a good snapshot of the current state of the practice and also helps everybody to kind of understand how scenario planning can be a useful and effective tool in their transportation planning processes. So this is going to cover a couple of key things. What you're seeing right now on the screen is just the outline of the guidebook. So we talk a lot about what is scenario planning and where did it come from. Why is it so critical for today's times? Why do it in transportation? You know, scenario planning is used quite often in a community planning context, but we also are seeing it more and more become a critical tool in transportation. We want to talk specifically about examples of that. We want to make sure, though, that one of the things we've been hearing from folks over the last several years is that there are some barriers to scenario planning. So how might you scope your scenario planning process or set expectations differently to help you overcome some of those barriers? We're going to talk a little bit about that as well. And lastly, we're going to look at, you know, how do you put a scenario planning process into motion to really make sure that you're doing transportation planning with foresight and insight. So thinking about it again, you know, what is scenario planning? If you're on this call, I'm thinking that maybe you've heard of this before or you've been involved in a scenario planning process. What it essentially allows us to do, particularly as transportation professionals, is to look at futures that are not just based on past trends. We can consider what ifs, and we can really think about what is likely to happen, which could be based on past trends, what could happen in the future, but more importantly, what does the community want to happen? What are we trying to aspire to? Scenario planning is not about developing forecasts so much as it is a proxy for looking at the issues and opportunities associated with those different futures. So it becomes really important when faced with kind of conditions in your community or your organization where some of the key assumptions about the future have been called into question or there's community conflicts arising. All of those things are good prompts for why scenario planning might be an effective tool to supplement your traditional processes. So if we think about some of the goals of scenario planning, one of the things that we discovered, I think, in putting this guidebook together is that oftentimes we would hear from people that we went through a scenario planning process and we didn't quite get to implementation. And I tried to dig a little bit deeper on that point because I think what we were hearing is that maybe there wasn't clarity up front in laying out what are the expectations of the scenario planning process, what are we trying to achieve. And what you're seeing right now on the screen is that scenario planning, we all know it can support decision making, but more often it's actually used as a way to conduct some new research, do additional outreach, and really begin to share some knowledge about either a changing trend or future condition that otherwise we haven't talked about or looked into, or it can help to identify if there is in fact a conflict about a certain policy direction or plan future. So if you think about it, I think one of the keys when you're laying out your scenario planning process is to be really clear about why you're doing it and what you're trying to achieve. And simply using it to share knowledge and make people more informed is an incredibly valuable step in any planning process. So if we think about, you know, scenarios as a way for us to look at different futures, there's really kind of three ways to think about the future. We know that most oftentimes when we're developing a long-range transportation plan or a community plan, we look at past trends and we try to say, okay, what is likely to happen in the future? That utilizes the best information we have, and we try to come up with a forecast or a future that's based primarily on not a lot of change happening. Another way to think about the future, though, is to say, well, what is the future we actually want? We know what we're looking at out there today, and we know what our trends tell us might be happening, but is that what we want, or is there something different that we're aspiring to? And that really reflects kind of the desires and the values of a community based on some plausible changes that could be put into motion to actually achieve that future. Another way to think about the future is to say, are there some uncertainties on the horizon? Are there things that we want to know more information about because we perceive there could be some threats or some issues in terms of our current path in terms of resiliency or other things? And so we really want to say, is there something out there that could happen, whether we desire it to happen or not, that we need to get a better handle on so that we can better plan for resiliency and get to the future ultimately that we want. One of the things that I think Rob set us up for well today is that at this point in time, scenario planning and transportation can be a really effective tool to deal with, and I use the word deconstruct uncertainty, because one of the things that we're hearing is there is a lot of change happening around us. We know that there's accelerating impacts to climate change, a lot of questions about how quickly and what it's going to look like in terms of deployment of connected autonomous vehicles. We have a lot of fiscal uncertainty right now. We also have just structural changes happening right before our eyes in the economy, and that's kind of being fueled by some of rapid advancements in technology. All of that uncertainty is making people kind of get stuck, perhaps, or be paralyzed because they don't know if they should make that investment that they planned for 20 years ago in light of all this uncertainty. Well, one of the things scenario planning can do is at least start to hypothesize what that uncertain future might look like, what its impacts might be, and then use that to really say, are our existing priorities still valid? Are they relevant? Is this still the way forward based on our best guess about what could happen? So it's a way to kind of, I guess we can't predict that uncertainty, but we can kind of diagnose it a little better and figure out, does it mean that we should be changing our path, or does it mean we need to start paying attention to certain signposts or guideposts in terms of changing conditions or trends? The other thing is that I've always been a big believer, and I think the early scenario planning really was about trying to make sure that we can build consensus for community values and community-driven transportation plans. And so one of the other things that I think we're seeing a lot of people use scenario planning for is to really look at, are there some changing trends in our community in terms of where people want to live, how they want to get around, and how might that change kind of our future vision of what our cities and communities might look like. We know that there's a growing interest in issues like equity and access to different things in life that we know transportation has a lot to do with. So are there ways that we might be aspiring to new goals concerning equity that then need to get folded into our transportation plans? We know that public health is a really big issue that's becoming more and more prominent in transportation. So again, what these three bullets are representing is that we're seeing some kind of interest in changing values, goals, or aspirations that scenarios can really help us to dig into and think through. So again, why do we want to use it in transportation? Well, there's really kind of four key things that we've discovered in kind of the creation of this guidebook. And the first kind of bucket, if you will, is that it helps us to ensure resiliency of our existing plans, and it helps us address that uncertainty. We also know that it's been proven to be and continues to be a really effective tool at visioning that then supports kind of trade-off discussions concerning different values. That then leads to broader consensus for your plan moving forward. We also know, though, that it's a great tool for performance-based planning, and we're going to talk a little about that as well. And finally, from a MAP 21 and FAST Act perspective, USDOT continues to support it as a best practice. So if we think about its use for kind of resiliency and addressing uncertainty, one of the, I think, most important documents that's come out in the last several years is the NCHRP report 750, which basically identified kind of these 6 driving issues that were going to influence transportation moving forward. These were things that TRB and the folks that gathered for this report really saw as things that could have transformational impacts on our transportation system. So already there's a pretty good compendium of information that helps you to predict and or think through the implications of fundamental economic changes, climate change, technological advances, sustainability, energy uncertainty, and shifting. So we know that we've got a body of research that actually has already been compiled that could be a starting place for your MPO or your community if you want to start to understand some of those what-ifs. We also know that several existing transportation organizations have already gone down this path. One of the more well-known, I think, examples of this was the Washington State DOT, where they basically looked at what's going to happen to our freight and goods movement network if there's major changes in global trade patterns. We know that the Hillsborough County MPO down in Florida actually just recently completed a pilot study to really look at specific vulnerabilities and threats associated with their infrastructure in the face of climate change. We know that the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Council has basically used kind of this idea of looking at various different future forces and kind of asking the question of, well, if this happens, how does that influence our local goals and aspirations? We also know that, again, most of the early scenario planning efforts in this country were focused on visioning and building consensus. FHWA published a guidebook, which has kind of been the go-to guidebook for transportation practitioners back in 2011, and it really presented the how-to do a scenario planning process that was about getting to a desired future. It really emphasized the importance of outreach, getting stakeholders to the table, and having good dialogue about different trade-offs, particularly as it relates to land use and transportation decision-making. So we know that this is kind of a tried and true sort of approach that has been used again and again by a lot of different organizations. So what's happening even more so today, I think, is that some of when Eric speaks to you from NARC, you're going to hear a little bit about the way in which we've seen different transportation agencies become advanced users of scenario planning, and there's still some out there that are just trying. Well, I would say that the advanced users, almost all of them started with a visioning exercise. So we know, for instance, Envision Utah 20 years ago did their blueprint. They're still going back and using scenario-based approaches to say, do we still have consensus for this way forward? Are there some different implementation strategies that we need to put in place to make sure we're achieving those goals? We know that the Chicago region, with their Go To 2040 plan, which was their regional long-range transportation plan, also took a pretty aggressive vision-based scenario approach where they basically said, here's the desired future we have concerning livable communities, investing in people and talent in our local governance, and really dealing with regional mobility. And they use the scenarios to kind of better understand the implications and opportunities of how they could get to those goals. SCAG 2040 out on the West Coast also basically did sort of a blueprint approach and really use that to better inform how they could be changing their land use and transportation strategies to really support a future vision. So one of the other areas in transportation where we're seeing increasing application of scenario planning is through performance-based planning. Another FHW guidebook that came out just last year describes how you can use it to really advance performance-based planning approaches. One of the things that I think is probably the biggest opportunity is in all scenario planning processes, you're really trying to identify key community values and goals, turning those into measures of performance or key measures of success. So very quickly we can show a direct correlation between here's what we know our community values and here's how we think we can measure success. that really is kind of the basis for how you start a performance-based scenario plan, or performance-based planning process, excuse me. So I think that, again, this is just another technique that can really help with identifying, for instance, a broader set of measures from which you then can evaluate scenarios and incorporate kind of long-term planning, how you are making progress towards those measures and measures of effectiveness. So we know from a performance-based planning approach that, again, there's several places across the country that have taken this on. MTC in the San Francisco Bay Area really bold performance measures that then both drove the scenario development and evaluations and have really been kind of a cornerstone of how they're measuring success. Minnesota State DOT, they took the approach of really trying to understand from a performance-based perspective how their transportation system could operate and be managed over time by considering very different investment scenarios. And so it was a very helpful process in terms of the stakeholder engagement to basically say, if you fund the system this way, this is how the system's going to perform. If you fund it this way, it might be very different. And that became really important for helping to build consensus for the ultimate funding of the statewide plan. Additionally, a project that's just now wrapping up that Volpe was involved with, as well as others, is looking at kind of the Central New Mexico Climate Change Project. Interesting about this is it looked at both impacts of climate change, but also strategies to mitigate for climate change. And through that process, again, there were some very kind of crystal clear performance measures that were being looked at, and it became a way to really benchmark how are we doing in terms of the impacts of climate change, but more importantly, are there some specific measures or goals that we can now start orienting towards to really mitigate for that climate change. The last piece of kind of why use this in transportation planning is, as was mentioned early on, FHWA is supporting this effort, and there's a continuing ongoing federal commitment. If you read the language of the FAST Act, it actually speaks very specifically to supporting a new framework for voluntary scenario planning. But a new requirement that's in there as well is agencies to think about resiliency. And I think that is really maybe the door opener for these sorts of approaches. We also know, as Michael mentioned early on, that FHWA continues to provide technical assistance and peer-to-peer workshops so that as we all start to try to utilize these approaches, there are resources out there, there are best practices, and we can, particularly with the peer workshops, really learn a lot from what our partner agencies have done and kind of how they've gone through that process. So one of the things that the guidebook is attempting to kind of speak to is we've tried to capture these are the different ways in which scenario planning is being used. But we also recognize that there have continued to be barriers of different organizations wanting to get engaged in a scenario planning process. We kind of decided that there was really a need to pay attention to how we scope scenario planning. And one of the first things, I had a conversation with somebody in a transportation agency, and they said, gosh, we really want to do scenario planning. I said, well, why? Yeah. And they couldn't answer the question other than it's a good thing to do. So what I think maybe one of the first things that we as transportation leaders need to think through a little better is to really flesh out the why. One of the things that a scenario planning approach can really do is if there is a emerging community conflict or concern and you're hearing buzz, whether it's through your elected officials or you're getting a lot of community feedback, and they're saying, hey, we're worried about this, or we're really concerned about the direction we're going in. We don't support that transportation referendum, and here's why. That should be a signal some stakeholder concerns or conflicts within your community for which a scenario-based approach could help you deal with. We also know that if you are basically trying to deal with uncertainty and you're starting to kind of see some socio-demographic changes, or let's say land use patterns in your region are starting to change, how is that going to influence travel demand and travel behavior? Well, we know if we just keep doing our analysis based on the way our cities developed in the past, we're probably not going to get the right answers if we're trying to plan for a different pattern in the future. So one of the things that, you know, defining the why could be that you need to really do some additional research on those emerging or changing trends and decide, are we seeing something here that might prompt the need for us to do a scenario-based process? The other thing that what a lot of what we would call next generation scenario planning seems to be about is dealing with those uncertainties and threats. So there has been a fair amount of research recently published to allow any MPO or any small government to basically say, we want to think about climate change. Well, you as that local agency don't have to go out and do your own research per se. There's a lot that you can pull from existing sources. But if there's local governments that are saying, you know, that's a concern, then that may be a good reason to start looking at scenario planning. Another thing is just, you know, if we think about those external forces or threats, making sure that there's a way that you all can get some insight from your local government or your community members to say, well, what are people really concerned about versus what are all of the things that we could be worried about in the future? And I'd like to just kind of show an example of that in action, which is the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. Basically, their most recent effort in scenario planning was something called Future Forces. And they started that exercise by asking people, what are all of the things that could influence our region moving forward? And you can see up on the screen, we've got I can't see my words here, but we've got, you know, we've got a lot of technology-related forces. We've got climate change-related forces. We've got, you know, the fact that our economy is kind of shifting to more of a free agent economy. All of these issues were identified as potential things that could fundamentally change the way in which that region was going to need to plan. And so what they did is they allowed all of the stakeholders to really get a better sense of, well, if we really feel like people are moving back to the cities, do we think that's going to have a high likelihood or a high impact on our region? If so, we know that's a future to deal with. But some of the other ideas that were thrown out there, you know, for instance, the shared car economy and just kind of that whole shared mobility approach. And when they went out to their stakeholders, folks didn't see that that was going to have as transformational impact as other forces. So what I really like about this as example is that if you've got a lot of people just worried about everything, this is one way that you can kind of narrow that down and come up with what are the big things that we really want to kind of test out and get a better handle on in terms of how they might influence our region moving forward. So once you've kind of defined the why of scenario planning, the next step is to really make sure there is clarity about the expected outcome. If you all recall, there was a, in the early slide, I kind of said there's really two big things that planning. One is information sharing and just a better understanding of what's happening in a region, and two is decision making. I would say every time you do scenario planning, you always accomplish number one, but the decision making may be a to-do after the fact, meaning you can go through a scenario planning exercise and not actually come to a single decision or a necessary change in your plan, but you've become way more informed about how you're going to need to address issues moving forward. So one of the first things when you're laying out your scenario process is to set those goals. What are we trying to accomplish? Do we just want to understand some of these emerging issues, test resiliency, those sorts of things? Or are we really trying to build consensus for a new way forward, a major change in a policy? That right there really can, I think, put in place the right set of expectations with your stakeholders. It can also better define who your stakeholders need to be, because if you're getting to a decision point, you know that's got to be a broader group. We also want to make sure that as we're thinking about the process, that we understand the different kind of futures that we want to pay attention to. Again, are we looking at just trend conditions and a probable future, or do we want to use the process to get to a more desirable future? Or again, are we trying to be exploratory and just better understand what ifs or uncertainties? So the next step then is based on kind of those two big questions up front, then you design your process, and that includes better understanding what are the resources that we have as an agency to do this. How can we design a process that matches basically our local capacity and funding abilities? One of the things I want to make sure you all get out of both this webinar and the ultimate guidebook is that ultimately scalable to anybody's capacity. We could all be in a room today and go through a scenario planning exercise that would leave us better informed about a key issue. That could be done with flip charts and note cards and a couple of key speakers or research documents that have already been done. Or you can have a very robust process that, again, has a lot of public engagement, uses sophisticated tools, and ultimately drives you towards a new set of decisions or a new set of performance measures that you're going to use to develop your long-range plan. Those two bookends are really important to kind of recognize that I think all of the issues we've been talking about, you can scale your process to address those issues, but scale it in a way that meets your local needs and local capacity. One of the reasons I mentioned early on that this guidebook was trying to respond to in some respects are those barriers. And so what this slide is just highlighting is that some of the barriers that were identified in the NCHRP report, snapshots of planning practice, basically said that, when you talk to folks, it's the magnitude of public involvement required. Well, then when you're scoping it, really think about that outreach to the specific issues and the why, and see if you can build your scenario planning process into maybe a smaller stakeholders group, or piggyback it on another planning process you already have. The need for public outreach and involvement really has a lot to do with defining the why and what you're trying to get out of the process. Another challenge cited is just required funding. Well, that kind of goes with the previous bullet. Then if you think about it and you're trying to scope the process, make sure you scale an approach that works with your available resources. Maybe reiterate expectations to your stakeholders and the general public that scenarios aren't forecast, therefore we're not going to use extensive modeling. I mean, there's ways to, again, set expectations so that you can really tailor this to something that you all can fund on your own or get some additional help for it. Another challenge cited was the lack of knowledge and skills to actually construct scenarios and run the process. As I mentioned, there has been a host of new research that's come out. There are several best practices. There are a lot of things that I think transportation practitioners, having never done this process before, can actually pull from and run with. We also know, as it's been mentioned, FHWA is a big supporter, so there are some resources there. So again, I think that the knowledge base is just continuing to grow, and I think there's a lot more information out there today than there was even 5 years ago. The other challenge that we heard in that report in particular is that scenario planning, because so often it was associated with how to manage growth and think about transportation related to that growth, there are many communities that aren't growing. Well, I would argue that that's actually a whole scenario process in and of itself, meaning you don't need growth challenges to do scenario planning. You can deal with anything with scenario planning. So you can create a process that basically says, okay, we're losing population. What does that mean relative to how our existing infrastructure may need to be repurposed or reused, or what are the priority corridors that are still going to be relevant if our population is cut in half? So again, the scenario planning process it's applicable to any sort of issue and any sort of dynamic in a community. The last challenge is the tool and data requirements. And I'm going to let Eric speak more to that because the NARC report really gets at this issue. But one of the things I can say is that if that is a barrier for you and you can't solve it, go low tech. You don't need to do extensive, you don't need to use extensive tools and have a lot of data. You can go low tech and build on others' research. And one low-tech example I just wanted to highlight, this was used at the TRB Scenario Planning Conference back in August last year, and it was put together for a workshop session, which basically took a big piece of paper and said, we've got some future uncertainties related to federal funding and climate change. We want to understand what sort of scenarios we could put together that would help us understand those implications. And you can see by the photograph, it really was a brainstorming session. We were able to come up with 4 distinct scenarios and kind of think through the issues and opportunities. So again, this was done in, I think, a 2-hour session with just a marker, a piece of paper, and a few people around the table. So keep your brains and minds open to low-tech. All right, so we've talked about the why. We've talked about how to scope and scale the process. The last thing here is just to really highlight that the fundamental way to get through the scenario planning process has not changed. Whether you're dealing with uncertainty or you're trying to get to a desired state, there really are kind of these 6 key things that should be guiding your process. Step number 1, as we mentioned, how do we get started? If you're really trying to get to that desired future, you know you're going to need to do a lot more community outreach because you need to understand what the desires are of the community. Versus if you're doing something related to uncertainty or exploratory, how do we get started might involve, boy, we got to go out and do some research. We got to pull down kind of the latest and greatest research that's been compiled so that we understand the implications moving forward. Where are we now? That's kind of the second step in the process. That's really understanding kind of your current trends as well as your current kind of community values. And again, I think in all scenario planning processes, we always are trying to have some baseline or some trend from which we can evaluate those different futures. So in the example of a exploratory sort of approach, impacts of climate change, you may say, okay, we are at this point experiencing flooding, 100 days out of the year. And if we look back over the last 10 years, that's a 20% increase. And that's our baseline condition. We're going to basically try now to look at scenarios that might say, does that increase over time? If so, how much? And how might that influence our infrastructure and resiliency needs on that front? Step number 3 is, again, where do we actually want to go? So even if you're exploratory or if you're doing just kind of a trend-based analysis, all of our plans have specific goals and specific aspirations they're trying to get to. So where we want to go is all about that. If we're planning for resiliency, one of the key questions we want to ask is, well, what does success look like if we're trying to be more resilient to, say, climate change? If we're planning for the deployment of connected and autonomous vehicles, how do we want to maybe utilize that technology moving forward to make for a better kind of transportation system? So we always want to make sure we're asking the question of ultimately where do we want to go. Step number 4 is getting at what could the future look like. Again, is it something about desired future, probable futures, or some sort of unknown? And then the step number 5 is really evaluating those different futures against each other. And again, that's something that can be done, as I just showed a picture of, in a room around a table, or we can use some pretty sophisticated models and measures to help us better understand the implications of those different futures. Lastly, how do we get to the future we want? If you are going through this process, no matter what comes out of it, what you're trying to do is make sure that you've got a better understanding and are in a position to make changes or initiate additional plans or decision-making processes to ensure that you can get the future you want in light of everything that you've learned. So that last step is really, okay, what have we learned and how is that going to influence how we want to move forward? So again, this is kind of a big graphic, but it does walk you through the different phases of scenario planning and kind of shows no matter what sort of future you're dealing with, you can still use these 6 phases as your overall framework. So lastly, the guidebook, some of the key takeaways. Scenario planning remains an effective framework to address a lot of what I think our transportation planning agencies are dealing with. It can be really effective in dealing with conflicts or changes in terms of community values or aspirations. We've talked about it as a tool for dealing with resiliency and performance-based planning and addressing uncertainty. So for all of those reasons, we think that its use in transportation is only going to continue to be in demand and hopefully be applied. The guidebook, which we hope to have out by the end of this month, early July, will highlight some of the examples I mentioned today and also give you some of the how-tos in terms of both the process steps and knowing how to tailor your approach to really meet your needs and to match up with your local capacity.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kate. I mean, RPG has clearly done a ton of work on this. It's very comprehensive, and it's actually really exciting, I think, given all of the big changes that we know is happening. So thank you for all of that. And again, her last name is Angie, right? I'm
Yes,
very apologetic. Sorry for the mispronunciation there. I want to encourage everybody to keep sending in questions. We have a whole bunch of things in the hopper, and we're going to get to those just a minute. But first, I want to introduce Eric Zimmerman from NARC, who's going to present the initial findings of their recent research. Eric?
Thanks so much. Again, my name is Eric Zimmerman. I'm the Transportation Director at NARC. We're very pleased to be with you all today to discuss the results of our research and tell you a little bit about how we got to some of our conclusions and what some of the next steps are that we're very excited to tell you about as well. So to start a little bit with the project background, this was a project that was really inspired by several NARC members that had received funding through the Sustainable Communities Initiative, which I'm sure many of you know is a partnership between US DOT, EPA, and HUD. And these organizations had used their SCI dollars to either acquire or improve specific scenario planning tools. And while they had come to the conclusion that they undoubtedly wanted to continue using these tools, they really felt that they needed some ongoing support to continue using them and supporting them. So they wanted to explore some possibilities that would make the collection and maintenance of data easier and less costly, bring some standardization to the inputs and outputs from their tools that they were using, and other similar issues that they really saw as critical to improving the tools and improving the process of scenario planning for their organizations. So with an original grant from the Federal Highway Administration, we set out to explore the current state of scenario planning at the regional level, figure out how to improve the current processes and tools, and how to lower barriers to entry for organizations not using scenario planning. I also want to acknowledge and thank the foundational support we received from Summit Foundation and Transit Center. And with that, we subcontracted with Place Matters from Denver, Colorado, and Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in Cambridge, Massachusetts, for a couple different elements of this project that I'm going to tell you about now. So the primary research for the synthesis document was conducted by. What we really looked at was how regional organizations are using scenario planning, what encourages them to adopt scenario planning or increase its use, and how to reduce barriers to entry or otherwise encourage more widespread use of scenario planning. And as I mentioned, the deliverable on this will be a synthesis document with a number of recommendations for broadening and improving scenario planning and the tools that support it. And again, will be available hopefully in the same time frame as the guidebook at the end of this month or early next month. In addition, we also, based on the results of the research we conducted for the synthesis document, also wanted to explore the creation of a scenario planning consortium, and that's the work that the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy carried out for us. So telling you a little bit about how we got to our conclusions, we did, the first two are really the basis of the synthesis document. We conducted interviews with 24 regional planning organizations back in December of 2015, trying to get at how they use scenario planning in their decision making, the challenges that they face with the current set of scenario planning tools, and generally how to increase the adoption of scenario planning or better support the organizations that are currently using scenario planning. In addition, we held a convening with approximately 12 regional planning organizations in January 2016 that also brought together federal partners and academic experts to talk about some of these issues. We met in Washington, D.C. to discuss the findings of the interviews we had conducted and then develop something of an action plan for future collaboration. This meeting was made up primarily of executive directors with some technical folks, and so as a follow-on, though it didn't really inform the paper, it certainly informed our follow-on approach. We held a second convening with about another 12 regional planning organizations in September of 2016, where we met in Denver, Colorado, primarily bringing together technical folks with some executive director involvement as well. And those two, the interviews that we conducted in the first convening in Washington really formed the basis for the document that we created. So what we found in our research broadly is that there are essentially, and this is sort of the tool-focused aspect of what we looked at, there's really 4 platforms that are most commonly used among regional planning agencies that are doing GIS-based scenario planning. Those are Community Viz, Envision Tomorrow, Urban Footprint, and Urban Sim. Further, we found that the adoption of scenario planning really follows a typical diffusion of innovation curve, where there's a few agencies that are leading the way, sort of conducting the most robust processes, and then there's many others that are exploring or more likely using scenario planning, and then there's a few others beyond that that haven't used scenario planning at all. And a limited number of the regional agencies that are using scenario planning tools can be considered what we have termed creators and power users. And what differentiates these organizations are a few things. One is generally in-house expertise, where they're either creating tools themselves or making modifications to existing tools themselves in-house with their own staff. And generally, these are applied to a very broad range of issues, whether it be long-range plan combined with other considerations of other issues that the agency is dealing with. But beyond that, most agencies, of course, have a more limited capacity for scenario planning and rely much more heavily on assistance from consultants and other agencies. But users from really from all sort of capacity levels report a fairly high level of frustration with the costs of setup, maintenance, and use of the tools that they currently have, the lack of commonality in modeling methodologies, utilization of data, both inputs and outputs, and really the process for applying these tools to decision making. And in fact, even the highest capacity users report that these frustrations, these challenges, these barriers are really significant barriers to expanding the use of scenario planning internally or block innovation that might otherwise occur without these barriers. Here, to break down some of the results of what we found, as I mentioned earlier, there's really these 3 categories of creators and power users, intermediate users, and then the beginners and the folks that aren't using it as heavily. So across all of these categories, users face constraints, unsurprisingly, on funding, on staff time available to dedicate to scenario planning, and on data constraints. And what we found is that most of these categories really could benefit most heavily from peer support and exchange, from some amount of integration of tool and data integration, and then some level of financial or policy incentive from whatever level of government that might come. So to go a little deeper into the creators and power users, these are the organizations that really play a very important role in advancing scenario planning. They are the ones actively incorporating scenario planning into their regional decision making. They tackle some of the tougher issues regarding data collection and model interoperability. They incorporate a wide variety of issues, including land use, transportation, economic development, and resource management into their process. These are the folks you'll probably see presenting at planning and transportation conferences. And a really key characteristic of this group is their commitment to data-supported decision-making, which requires dedicated staff, often 3 to 12 people in their shop are committed solely to GIS and data analysis. They also have significant resources dedicated to acquisition, cleanup, and maintenance of data. And most of these represent larger metropolitan areas, but there are certainly some smaller agencies that have been important to advancing the scenario planning practice that we found through our research. Most of these creators and power users use a fairly diverse set of custom and off-the-shelf tools. They often combine tools together to suit their needs. Urban Footprint and Envision Tomorrow Plus are commonly used among this group, which also includes some longtime users of Community Viz. Many of these folks are in their second or third deployment of a tool, and each one notes that implementing a new tool is a very large effort that strains organizational resources, and note that sometimes a change is still necessary, that those resources have to be expended, but would love to be able to either move between tools or utilize multiple tools at the same time more easily. So to go a little bit deeper into you can see here some of the barriers to advancement that we found, many of which as I mentioned earlier, are sort of common across all of these groups, and then some of the strategies that would allow for advancement of scenario planning for this particular set of groups. I'll say both creators and power users have a fairly limited set of collaborators to work with, which is certainly a challenge. They are the ones setting they're out front. So there's also limited examples and best practices that they themselves can work from, and really could benefit greatly from an increase in a potential market for fee-for-service work, which could help provide them with additional resources for cutting-edge development of approaches, while also helping smaller organizations advance their practice of scenario planning. And among creators, these are the folks that infuse scenario planning really into most of their work. They do significant innovation in the field and receive significant political support and resources for their work. But it's important to note that certainly not unlimited resources. Of course, nobody gets that. But many of these groups have actually been the most vocal about the need to reduce the costs of maintaining tools and the burdens of scenario planning. So I did want to throw out one example of an organization in this group and sort of some of the challenges that they face that I think are interesting and speak to what we're talking about. The Mid-America Regional Council in Kansas City, Missouri, which was mentioned earlier, I think it's interesting as we were discussing what category they belong in. Certainly they see themselves as a creator. They are doing some very innovative work in scenario planning. They have their own scenario planning tool called Paint the Town, which they did use for a set of land use scenarios, now use it more for predictive work. But they're also a user of Envision Tomorrow, something that they've adopted for a number of reasons, trying to sort of moving away from a homegrown tool towards something that's a little more standardized, a little more updated by the tool developer. And so as a result, they also see themselves in some ways as an intermediate user because they're new to the world of Envision Tomorrow. So, you know, not everything is cut and dry. There's certainly different challenges that different organizations face depending on where they are with this process. And I think we need to work to address or our work with all of those challenges across several of these organizations. Another good example here is the Denver Regional Council of Governments. And they are a third-generation urban sim user. Their most recent approach took only 8 months to get up and running, which was much faster than previous iterations. And so they are certainly power users of the current open source version of the tool. They use it for its predictive econometrics and because it's powerful enough, frankly, to offer down to the local level as well as work at the regional level. And a key piece for them is that as they increase their ability to use the tool, that really drove an additional desire for them to have additional functionalities. They started developing those additional functionalities in-house and then started sharing those with other users of the same tool and really have created essentially a user group of other users of Urban Sim in order to help facilitate those smaller organizations to innovate and move forward. So in a way, they're really a model for the consortium that I'm going to discuss with you a little bit in just a few minutes. So power users, again, extensive use of scenario planning, high degree of experimentation among this group, and again, with sufficient political support and resources. And I know there's a lot of text on these slides. You'll be able to find them as soon as our paper is out. You'll have all of this beautiful information in your hands. So intermediate users are also important and critical in the adoption of scenario planning tools among organizations. Peer organizations tend to look to this group for options when their own in-house capacity is limited, or they face data gaps that they can't solve themselves. Third-party support is often commonplace among this group and often essential to their being able to launch scenario planning efforts. Community Viz is one of the more popular choices among this group, and especially for those just starting out with scenario planning, but there are other tools that are in use here as well. So one example among this group, well, let me say, so some of the barriers unique to this group include the in-house technical knowledge, because they tend to be smaller staff sizes and less funded, a lack of political will or support among either board members or community members, and or risk aversion to trying something new and untested, simply because they have less capacity for making a mistake, frankly, with lower funding or lower political support for trying something new. One good example, I think, in this group is the San Luis Obispo Council of Governments, SLOCOG, in California. As part of our survey, I was going back and looking at some of the comments that were sent in, and one of the things they sort of led with in their advice portion, what would you tell other organizations? One of the things they said is they don't use the term scenario planning, and I think that's a great indication of a more limited political and or community will to use something new that you can't even call it scenario planning, but they certainly see the importance of it and the power of it, and so they just find ways to use it without calling it scenario planning. And they also note that they don't have the capacity of the Big Four, the Big Four cogs in California, but feel that they've developed something that is solid for them and really is working very well for them. So again, that sort of lower capacity organization that is still innovating and trying new things with their scenario planning process, but might not be able to go as far as some of the larger organizations. They're community Viz users. They have one staff member committed that is really trained in the use of the tool out of a staff of 20. So again, it just shows some of the challenges that some of the intermediate users face in this regard. Beginning users, these are the infrequent or limited users of scenario planning tools. They generally have little or likely no in-house capacity. Some of the barriers that are unique to this group will also be a lack of political will. There might not be any political will or understanding among elected officials about the benefits of scenario planning. And also some significant risk aversion in this group as well. Some of the items that really could advance scenario planning we found among this group would be marketing. So again, to those decision makers to try and build up political will, and then also more inexpensive but powerful tools that they could implement quickly and less expensively. And then you can see the watchers and the non-users. Again, these are folks that may have used scenario planning previously for a limited purpose, maybe aren't now, maybe are dabbling in it. These are often smaller agencies which may have expressed interest in scenario planning and how it could benefit them, but many don't show us a strong understanding of the process or of the tools, and have really expressed a need that if they're going to get into this game, they need additional training and assistance, while others may have had some understanding and interest, but really lacked the funding, the time, and the other resources that would be necessary to implement scenario planning. And again, the same thing here, political will is certainly an issue, lack of resources, risk aversion, all big challenges for these sort of get these folks started in the process. So we also looked at some of the elements of success. What did folks identify that we interviewed as the sort of key elements? One was regularity of use. While episodic use can sometimes keep costs down, it also means then every time you go to use the tool, you have to gear back up, get your data back together, and get folks trained, which can actually drive costs, so that really the more consistent use of the tools actually can keep costs just barely higher than if you have to sort of retool every time you do it. In addition, really allows for incentives to keep data current and available, which can also provide other benefits as well. Data is certainly a second area identified. This is obviously a key to success with any planning process, certainly in scenario planning, but it's also a major barrier. There's a wide variety among organizations of data availability, interoperability, and the cost of acquiring, cleaning, and maintaining data can be significant. You know, organizations that can either tap into shared data sets or that have created shared data sets for their regions tend to report that data and data collection and maintenance burdens were greatly reduced. So that's an important consideration in this regard as well. A flexible approach is essential, can be implemented as needed over time. You know, this idea of incrementalism, I think, is important here as well. And then finally, training and assistance, which can come in the form of financial assistance, such as through SCI or other similar programs, tool and platform assistance with the help of partner or peer agencies, and then capacity building and training is a third. In the case of the users that we have spoken with, many of the sort of power users or upfront users started out with some assistance, but really have built their own capacity in-house over time, and that most organizations that we talked with really express an interest in additional peer support. This is something that almost every organization we spoke with identified as essential, and that can be either through informal networks and events or through more formal programs to improve collaboration and partnership among agencies and among organizations. So again, to bring this all together, you know, the barriers and limitations you can see listed here you know, are fairly significant, but I think also are things that can certainly be dealt with if done appropriately. You know, whether it's staff capacity, finding ways to do some things together that reduce that burden. You know, data, the same was reported. So you can see the list there of what needs to be overcome in order to increase the use of scenario planning. And all of this taken together led us to the primary recommendation based on the research and discussions. There was really a pretty significant agreement among the folks that we talked with, at least, that that users, scenario planning users from a pretty wide variety of perspectives, could really find solutions to these current challenges with facilitated collaboration. And so that led us to this recommendation that the formation of a consortium, a formal consortium of organizations and other stakeholders hosted by an outside independent entity to promote innovation and collaboration among users and generally advance the field of scenario planning. So the discussion here really centered around the idea that you know, established user groups and learning networks could help organizations of all capacities share information and learn from other users. There could be to improve the tools themselves, including identifying service gaps and inefficiencies, increasing interoperability, increasing standardization, and having ways to feed that information back to the tool developers themselves. And generally just building collective power for users to address the needs and opportunities that they see that arise through the use of these tools, in addition to sharing best practices and examples of successful use of scenario planning. As mentioned earlier, some of those power users find it a little bit harder to have perspective on you know, how to make maximum use of their tools. And this is one way for those users to share with each other, as well with other you know, users that might be intermediate or in those other categories, to improve their use of the tools as well. And so as a result of our work on the paper, we also then separately contracted with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy to bring this research forward and really begin to explore setting up a scenario planning consortium, what that might look like based on those findings and recommendations. And so through their work, you know, we are very pleased to say that I think we have announced the formation of a consortium, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that now, and how you might get involved. And I will say that at this point, we contracted with them to explore the creation of this, and at this point, Lincoln has decided that they are willing to carry this forward and is supporting it as the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. So I think this is a very exciting development, and one that I hope will have a tremendous impact going forward on the use of scenario planning and getting rid of some of these barriers to entry. So you can see the goals: increasing the number of entities using it, and expanding the capacity and understanding among the groups, among the organizations or folks that are already using scenario planning. So membership is anticipated to be open to any organization or individual, regional or other planning agencies, nonprofits, academics, software developers, and it's anticipated all members will have access to any of the materials developed by the consortium. There will be a set of peer networks. There will be an annual meeting, and also responsibility of advancing the goals and activities of the consortium. This is really seen as a consortium of users or consortium of peers, and so it's going to be peer-to-peer that's going to determine what the consortium works on and how to move it forward as well. There will be a small fee that folks will be asked to pay, which can be accommodated depending on what the capacity of your organization is. And Lincoln Institute has hired what will become a full-time staff person to facilitate and develop the consortium with a scheduled launch in fall of 2017. So a couple of the initial efforts of the consortium will be the establishment of working groups, and those working groups, again, because they're going to be led by users or consortium members, really could take on any number of forms. It could be among different capacity organizations. It could be among different tool users. There's really a lot of opportunity. Again, if we bring academics in, there's a lot of opportunities for different ways that those working groups can be structured, and that will be determined as we move forward. In addition, another initial effort that can be carried out, I think, fairly expeditiously is the creation of an online educational library, a one-stop shop where a lot of the information that is out in different forms can be brought into one place, whether it's reports or curricula for educators or other tools, things like that have been developed and can be shared more widely. So here's a quick overview of the timeline. You can see the Lincoln staff contact there. If you or your organization is interested in becoming involved with the consortium or learning more about it, Janae Futrell can be contacted at the email address you see there. You can see the expected timeline, the launch coming in November with a meeting to be held potentially in Denver. That's not confirmed yet, with some activities leading up to that, including the beginning work on establishing working groups, establishing the library as mentioned, and establishing web presence. So if you're interested in this, I suggest you get in touch with the Lincoln Institute. They'd be happy to tell you more. That's all I had. Thank you very much.
That's great, Eric. Thanks so much. It's great to hear the announcement of the consortium. I think clearly it's going to address some of the challenges that we've heard so far and some of we mentioned already. So we have about 15 minutes for questions. So I would encourage folks to keep sending them in. We're going to try to deal with as many as we can. We're going to try to bucket some of these. We got a lot of good questions and comments that come in. I want to start with one that I think is pretty broad, maybe for everybody, but Kate, particularly I think for you. What are some of the insights, perhaps some common insights that were across the multiple scenario planning efforts that seem to arise frequently as transportation institutions employ this tool? You kind of talked a little bit about this, but are there big insights that cut across all these different examples?
Yeah, I think one thing that is interesting as I was listening to Eric's presentation about the continued barriers being political will and risk aversion and things like that. And yet I know that if you're asking the right why question up front, that question really does need to be posed to the elected officials. Because I think what often gets lost sometimes is that a good scenario planning process is not simply a technical process. It really is this broad information sharing, discussion of trade-offs, discovery of new information that maybe those elected officials weren't aware either could be a threat or on the horizon. And I feel like that sometimes us planners and staff folk often jump into the technical side, and in fact what's needed is a pretty strong sense of who are the people that need to be informed, and how do we build a process to make sure they're learning as we go. So I would say that's an overarching finding that really applies to any process that you're deploying.
And then something I think that's related, another comment came in, that data gathering and modeling and processing the model output seem to be major components of scenario planning. But scenarios can be formed regardless of the ability to quantify them and model them. Is what you're saying. It's really the process that's the most important thing in the output. Is that right?
Absolutely, and I think that's what, I mean, Eric, I think there's a whole group of those power users and creators that have gotten so good at it that they want more robust tools. They want to be able to measure and quantify a whole host of issues. And so the tool explosion and development, I think, is a wonderful thing. That said, it's not a requirement. It's not a necessary piece of the puzzle. If, you know, again, if you're trying to deal with certain issues, you specifically want to quantify things, you're going to have to use tools. But if you're trying to, again, use current research or, you know, bring new ideas to the table or otherwise, you know, deal with a conflict in your community, I don't think you necessarily have to have a tool in every instance.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that led even the power users, the organizations that wanted to spur some of this exploration, is that they'd like to see a reduction in the difficulty of using the tools, so that to the extent that that is the right approach, which in some cases it does provide, that might be the right way to go, we should make that as widely accessible. But I do think that some of the demystification of scenario planning is positive, where we might be able to go to some of these smaller organizations and say, you know, I think you said it great, you said it well, don't lead with the tool necessarily, lead with the process or the outcome, right, or some of the other things that make it better to sell. So that's great.
And something that maybe stick with you, the four criteria, the four categories of agencies that you pulled together was really interesting. Do you find that the creators and the power users are good at lots of different things, or are these guys just particularly good at scenario planning? And is that a common kind of characteristic, that these are just high quality?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are some of the MPOs and regional councils that show up, you know, in a lot of places for a lot of things. So, you know, but that also tends to be the organizations that do have great political buy-in from their leaders, and some of the other things that we identified as potential barriers for other organizations. So there is an element of that, certainly. You know, and again, the purpose for spreading this is that they see the immense power of this process and of these tools, and want to spread it more widely, so that, you know, they see those barriers as you know, potentially overcome, and think that they can have a role in doing that.
Something that keeps coming up too, it's sort of related, but maybe for you, Kate, that maybe put you on the spot here. One of the uncertainties in all this stuff is the political, and the kind of the funding questions. Things like climate change, which has come up a lot in this conversation today, is guys kind of fraught with inconsistencies and uncertainties in lots of places. How do you deal with something that's that big? Does it have the potential to torpedo balance these exercises? How do you avoid it? I don't even know how you would begin to address something like that in a place where it is contentious. Yeah,
I mean, I think one of the ways that you can start that conversation is, you know, first of all, the words we use, the language, the framing is everything. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that if we just you know, simplify it to what are things that are happening to our transportation system, which we know as kind of the folks behind the scenes could be very directly attributed to a changing climate, but what we're really trying to deal with is this roadway keeps getting flooded out. These mudslides are happening. These things that we are seeing more frequent events of, we as a transportation agency cannot afford not to better plan for that. So I think if you bring it back to the fiscal kind of preservation and maintenance and those sorts of things, that becomes, I think, a very depoliticized and easier conversation to have. So I would say on that topic, that's how you would go there, is one way. I think the other thing, though, that a lot of the early scenario planning efforts were criticized for is that they went into those projects with a non-neutral position, meaning a lot of the early land use and transportation scenario planning was really about looking at, let's build our communities to be more multimodal, to be not just auto-dependent. And I think that sometimes led people to think, oh, if you're doing scenario planning, you must just be pushing a smart growth approach, or you must just be pushing for walkability or transit. And the reality is that's not true. I mean, scenario planning doesn't come with it a set of preloaded objectives necessarily. So I think those are two things just to, again, in the framing and if you're about to go through this and educating your elected officials on why are we doing this, what are some of the assumptions we want to start with, and what do we want to learn from this process or decisions we want to make.
Good. I think there's also an element in some of the stepping back also. I think what you were kind of explaining was bringing some data to the situation as well, and that is kind of the stepping back. It's showing, look, we're not coming at this with an agenda. Here's what we're seeing. Either we can make this choice and it goes in that direction, or we make this choice and it goes that direction. Hopefully, through that process, whether that's developed with tools or developed in another way, hopefully that does sort of walk it back from the edge a little bit, and people see why the conversation is important and why it's happening.
Yeah, it really does seem it's data, transparency, communication that kind of gets you to some kind of conversation. Yeah. So there are a couple questions. I'll kind of bucket some of these. Maybe put you on the spot again. At the beginning, I think it was Ken or Mike, somebody mentioned that scenario planning should be not a replacement for the traditional planning process. A bunch of the questions, and some folks are kind of curious, well, what's wrong with the traditional planning process, and why can't that itself serve the same kind of function that we're trying to deal with here? What do we think about the traditional demand model? Does that need to be updated? Does it need to be scrapped? Does it have any bearing on today?
There was a lot in that question, but I'll speak to one thing. One of the things that we do acknowledge in the guidebook is that in transportation planning in particular, we did spend a lot in investing in trying to forecast travel behavior and travel demand. And we base those forecasts on a particular form and community pattern in terms of how our cities were shaped and all of those sorts of things. Over the last 50 years, we have seen some significant changes in both travel behavior and travel demand. I mean, if you just take, for example, we were planning for households that had one income person or one income generator back in the 60s and 70s, and then when we ended up planning for two-person income generating households, that fundamentally changed kind of regional transportation dynamics. So the caution in simply using a forecast that's based on past trends is you can be blindsided very quickly if you're not paying attention to there's some things that are happening that could put us on a different trajectory than we have been in the past. And I think those are the sorts of reasons why it's not as if, you need to do scenario planning all the time, but you better be paying attention. And if there's something that's starting to emerge, again, whether it's climate or impacts of a changing climate, whether you're seeing significant changes in kind of who's living in your community or their preferences for where they want to live, where they want to work, and how those things could lead us to really making the trend that we've built these 20-year, 30-year plans on almost irrelevant. Yeah. So I think that's the reason why you still need to do kind of traditional planning, where at some point you lock into, here's our forecast and we're going to make some decisions based on that, but making it a more informed process is about looking at some of these different futures that either could impact us or might be more of what we want or reflect those emerging trends or changes.
I mean, I think that the question itself highlights the challenge of planning by itself. I mean, when you're talking 20 or 30-year plans, the challenge of putting your organization's name and date on something like that in a world where we don't really know 5 years down the road what transportation is going to look like, I think is a particular challenge. But, so when, I don't hear from a lot of members that they think that the entire underlying planning process needs to be changed, but I do see, and I think what I hear a lot more is that more and more do see scenario planning as an essential component to that process, because it does take into account this broad range of factors that is changing at a much more rapid pace necessarily than some of the long-range forecasting that they have to do.
And as a supplement, not a replacement or an alternative or anything.
Correct. Yeah.
There's I have two more. I think I have two more quick questions. Eric, a bunch of things. I think folks are looking for specifics about the report, which I know is coming out shortly.
Yeah.
But a couple of things that keep coming up. Folks are wondering whether or not the places you examined are places that are just using the 4 scenario planning tools like BIS, Urban Sim, and all that, or are these places, you look at places that are doing different types of scenario planning, maybe not with those particular technical tools?
It is mostly sketch planning tools. We did look at there's a variety, I think about 30 different tools represented among the groups that we interviewed. So some of them are using obviously multiple tools within that. But it's not entirely focused on sketch planning tools, but that is the biggest grouping of tools. But I do think, I hope at least, that some of the conclusions and some of the follow-on that we've established really apply far more broadly to some of the more exploratory, processes, the things that, where you can kind of do these one-off, looking at one-off issues or dealing with uncertainty in a more segmented way. I think it applies, more broadly, especially the consortium itself, and the development of the consortium, I think, has an opportunity to bring all of that sort of under a roof,
sure.
and sort of deal with them all together in ways that hopefully will cross-inform and really help, all sides. So.
And that'll be clear in the report, I guess, some of those details.
Yeah.
So the last thing, just for both of you, so what is then the biggest threat then for using scenario planning in an effective way right now?
I don't know I don't think, honestly, I think it's becoming, it is becoming more mainstream to engage in scenario planning. I think the biggest threats are the assumptions that you have to use sophisticated tools, or that you're not aligning the why to the process you design, and you're just doing it because it's the latest and greatest planning technique. I think that has a tendency to create scenario planning processes that don't meet expectations, that don't actually resonate with either elected officials or the community. So I think it's the careful and wise scoping and kind of early really making sure that you're doing this for the right reasons. And without that, I think we can spend a lot of money and come up with a lot of interesting things, but ultimately we may not build the support we need for how to move forward based on those insights.
Yeah, I think my answer is related. I think it's making sure that as we move, as we think of ways to move this entire process forward, the natural focus goes to the ones that the folks that are doing the coolest and newest and greatest things, but making sure that we're bringing all the folks, all organizations along that are really interested in doing this, showing them, I think, is an important part of what comes out of today, showing them that there are different ways to do that there are different ways to achieve this end that might fit better with the constraints that they're feeling at home, and that that really could play because the bell curve, as I mentioned earlier, the bell curve really doesn't show us that there's a ton of organizations not using it. I mean, most organizations are at least dabbling or are interested enough to be asking questions about how to integrate it. So
in one way or another.
We need to just take advantage of that, combined with, as mentioned earlier, changes in federal law that now highlight this as a possible tool, and take advantage of all that to move everybody forward in this, together. So.
Well, based on the attendance and the questions, there's a ton of interest in this. So. I know this is not the end of the conversation. This is clearly going to be just the beginning. I want to thank everybody for your participation on the call here today. If you'd like more information about this work, please feel free to contact any of us. The emails and contact information is circulating, or you can drop an email to publicaffairs@enotrans.org, and we can get it to the right person. I want to mention that all these slides are going to be available for download. A recording of this is also going to be available on the same web link for download. We will send that to all of the participants on this call, along with a link for the transcript of this call. AICP credits are going to be available. You have to log on to your My APA portal, search for FHWA in the provider section, and you should be able to find it. If not, again, please contact any of us, and we'll get you the right direction. And as I mentioned, the FHWA and the NARC publications will be emailed to all registrants as soon as they're available. I want to thank very much Ken and Michael from Federal Highway Administration, Kate Angie from the Renaissance Planning Group, and Eric Zimmerman from NARC. For all of us here at the Eno Center, I want to thank you all very much for your time. Have a great day, everybody.